Today's program has made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. I am Merle Lomrance, Director of Member Travel Services at the Newark Museum and coordinator of the Member Book Club. Today's book, Jon Meacham's His Truth is Marching On, will be discussed by Dr. Larry Greene, his students Margot Hall and Joseph Osai Bonsu. I want to particularly reach out and thank Mary Sue Price for connecting me to Dr. Larry Greene, who is an absolute gem, and I know you will enjoy his presentation. I want to turn the program now over to Dale Colston, who will introduce Dr. Larry Greene. Dale Colston is the principal librarian for the James Brown African American Room in the Newark Public Library. The James Brown African American Room fosters the history, culture, and literary achievements of African Americans. Would everyone please put themselves on mute? And if you have questions and answers, they will be taken at the end. Please put them in the chat room under questions and answers. So welcome, thank you, and Dale, please introduce Dr. Greene.
Thank you much, Merle. First, I'd like to thank the Museum of Art for their invitation today. Pleased to be a part of this program. On behalf of Library Director Jocelyn Bowling-Din and Board of Trustees Dr. Lauren Wells, New York Public Library appreciates our ongoing partnership, and we hope that we've been a good neighbor. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Larry Greene. Dr. Greene was educated at Seton University, Montclair State University, and received his PhD from Columbia. He specializes in the study of the Civil War, African American history, the Great Depression, and World War II. Dr. Greene has been a scholar resident at the Schomburg Center and attended NEH Institute on Afro-American Religion at Princeton University. He was a full scholar on research and teaching at the University of Munster, where he taught African-American history and Civil War history. He is a friend of the Public Library, and we always enjoy his visits. Join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Greene.
Thank you so much, Dale, for that introduction, and thank you, Shansu and Meryl and Leland for your help in putting together this program. It is so fitting. I would like to introduce my students, Joseph Bonsu and Margot Hall. Joseph is Ghana and was an excellent student in my African American history class. He brought a unique perspective to the class. His question always great. Joseph is a senior major creative writing and minoring in film studies. He aspires to be a screenwriter and also a filmmaker. So we look forward to seeing his name in the future, and I'm sure we will. I'd also like to introduce Margot Hall, who was a grad student, completed her MA at Seton Hall University. She was an excellent student in my class on African American history there. She was a graduate of Randolph-Macon College, where she majored in history and minored in music, something I just found, so we will have to have a music discussion at some point. But again, I am so happy to be here. The Newark Museum has part of my education as well as Newark Public Library. I spent many afternoons in both, looking at exhibits in the museum and also doing research at the Newark Public Library. And my thanks to Mary Sue Price for suggesting me. So I think it is only fitting that an early biography of what I suspect that will flow from the pen of historians and biographers comes from Jon Meacham. Jon Meacham is one of our great biographers. He is a wordsmith, as we would say, one who writes well and conveys his message so clearly. I would like to point out he is the author of Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. Perhaps we see that going on now. Franklin and Winston, of course, dealing with Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill in collaboration in World War II. The Hope, Glory Reflections on Words of Jesus from the Cross, and American Gospel, the Founding Father and the Making of a Nation. So the last two books are very interesting, as well as the first one that I mentioned. Because the first one, of course, deals with duality of American. It has the better angels, I would say, the worst devils in America. We have a history that we exalt, and then we have history that we need to explain why we're on the wrong side. And so Meacham looks at that. The latter two books are also very interesting because the latter two books look at Christianity and how it informs our national. I think that's him in a particular way. It gives him a particular insight into understanding John Lewis. For whatever one religious orientation may be or non-religious orientation, it is important to understand the way in which religion informed, the way in which religion informed John Lewis. It gave him courage, it gave him sustenance, it opened his eyes and gave him energy to confront the most evil aspects of American history, American apartheid. So John Lewis deserves no less a biographer for his introduction. Is preceded with the words civil rights icon. But his life was lived in the service of African American liberation, but also lived in the service of human liberation. So there are many standing names associated with the modern civil rights movement. Many disciples, nonviolence, their bodies on the line. John Lewis, one, that all through the 60s, it would be hard to find a meaningful event in civil history in that period in which John Lewis was not there. His book characterizes that. And there are wonderful photos there. I have some of them in the slide here, but his book is filled with great photos of these experiences. From sit-ins to freedom rides, John Lewis challenged the entrenched system of American apartheid. From Jim Crow to the overthrow counter Reconstruction, which occurred first, and then the Jim Crow era, to the civil rights movement, which historians call counter Reconstruction. The second Reconstruction. They call it the second Reconstruction. The Reconstruction in which we lost the 14th, 15th Amendments. They remained in the Constitution, but their enforcement was lost. We deserve our attention on Lewis, because John was one of the few people, but there were other civil rights movement, but he is one of those people that talk, but continually and persistently walk the walk. So he deserves our attention. So we could go to the next slide. And the next bullet point. Time magazine in a 1905 article wrote, saints amongst, and they listed Mabisa during the day of the liberal Catholic worker, John Lewis. So I'd like to read something that was in praise of this, of the autobiography of John Lewis, called Walking with Wind. Walking the Wind. And this is what was said. Where is it? There we go. Of all the surviving saints of the civil rights movement, John Lewis remains committed to its original creed, a stirred portrait of the power of moral consistency and courage. what you learn about John Lewis in this book, he did not through beatings, intimidation, a stay on that terrible Parchment Farm prison. John Lewis did not learn. It is extremely important. In those deep, darkest moments, John Lewis reached into Black Christianity, the Black interpretation of Christianity. What I'm suggesting is that African American Christianity was not the Christianity that slaveholders to place in the minds of enslaved. Be faithful to your masters. Is that justice would come, justice would eventually come. Also, John Lewis was like that term, like the Prosser brothers in Virginia, like Denmark v. South Carolina in 1822, or Turner in Virginia in 1831, the Prosser brothers in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. They felt that, yes, the book will promise a future in which justice would come, but one had the right to take justice into one's own hands. So John Lewis was critical of those who wanted to wait. High in the sky, in the afterlife, justice will come. So he was who wanted it now. So the criteria is one who lived an exemplary life, the criteria for sainthood, who's lived an exemplary life, service of Christian values and all of humanity. That is the criteria that I would argue that John Lewis in fact fit. Next bullet point. John Lewis, one people, one family, and one of us affects all. This is so important. So important. If you were to quotes for us or watch the funeral service for him, reports, you find them using these. I want to give you full quote that what John said. This is the third bullet point. That's the essence of it, but it's a much longer. So I want to quote to you from the last paragraph or autobiography, which often is not stated. There is an old adverb: when you move your feet. As a nation, if we care for the community, we must move our feet, our hands, our hearts, to build and not down, to reconcile, not to divide, love and not to hate, to heal and not to. In the final analysis, we are one family, one house. I'm thinking the biblical quote, "My house, my father are many mansions." Lewis had an appreciation of the diversity of America, but he also understood fault lines in the society, difficulty of all of the roots of that house together. He understood. The real question is, he was up against an element in American society from the very beginning that did not see the American house, one family. He saw it as separate. Blacks at the bottom, caste system, Asians at the bottom, and even then whites at the top. There were also many people saw society, and so wrong with it. So this is what we need to understand. John was up against a Maritite to pass after the counter-reaction. In Carol Ann's book, Rage, she talks about that every time there's some progress on the part of African Americans, you can expect the other drop, a backlash. Barack Obama saying very similar. Brian Anderson gives you since she's in chair of the African American Studies Department, you get a lot of examples of this. But what Barack Obama, that progress is not a strain, it's not a gradual ending line. It's not, because racism is really entrenched in America. and so difficult to remember. We see this. What I'm talking about here is the intrinsic. So if we go back and take a look at what Lewis's parents were into, they were born into Jim America. They were born in America at a time in which Black people were lending. Most of those lending publicly, some through an overtime. Figures indicate that maybe some Black people were killed in destruction. This is America they were. The promise of the reparation was land for the mule, Block Johnson. So parents were tenant farmers that you had. When John Lewis was born into that place in Troy, Alabama, into Pikes County, when he went there, he from a society, as points out, a society in which parents could not vote. Black did not vote. Polls were there. The 18th Amendment letter. Rights were gone. If we look at other institutions, there's a wonderful book by I.A. Newby, professor at University of Hawaii. And he wrote this interesting book. In Jim Crow's terms, it's not a defensive book, it's an analysis who defended you. Look at turn of this America all the way in the 20s, we find the sociological, the anthropological, the psychological, political science, and to some extent, African American racially inferior. That was a group of people and institutions that were not going to overthrow apartheid, but going to what? Reinforce. American institutions and American intellectuals reinforce racial status quo. And this is John Lewis will be in the 60s. Though the time you get to the 60s changed and had liberalized, the damage had been done. The seed had been, even for slavery, that African Americans were inferior. Say this to sense of understanding the brutality that was forced upon John Lewis and all of those folks that you saw at Edmund Pettus himself. How was that mind created? Who created that? Many of us were brainwashed by American institutions. And it is that in the sense that they could commit things of extreme talent. Important. But John Lewis brainwashed and others who saw to change the law. John Lewis, from an early period, began to interpret the scriptures. So let's go to slide. Okay. Congressman John Lewis on struggle, 5 precepts. When you see something that is not fair, not just, you have to say something. You have things as, of course, he 60s. Americans had done so. They were not listening. The president's lynching bill that he put forth and failed decade after decade. Vote is precious. The vote is the most precious tool we have in of 2019 to Shelby whole referencing, weakening the 65. It is important to understand that John Lewis had sat in the 19th counters are not only about to recognize the reality of power, that they needed power, they wanted the vote. It suggests that much of political terror had to do with keep voting. That is one of the main formation of the coup in Pulaski, Tennessee. John Lewis said, good trouble and help redeem the soul. And that is, and what of those others came, okay, Bob Moses, okay, Central School, 9 and 7. See, life where power remains, justice is reflect few. Powers, he's saying this, George Floyd, Think of how after that. Cancer. He is there. Ours is not this 1 week or 1 year. Ours is this time, or maybe even many one of us, and every do our part. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. Going to be setbacks if you don't get in the struggle, because there are going to be set off the. Can you go back into it? This is a struggle. Racism is so our lifetime, or even many lifetimes, and each one, every generation must do our part. We must do our part. So that's very. When you Meacham, and it's hard to do the book just a short time, but what I did in within a larger context, you will see along the way John Lewis's reliance on teachings, Bible. But his Bible is liberation, the acceptance of the step. Next, yeah. This is a young activist, John Lewis. I think he's really great. Great picture from his early days at SNCC. I should point out some other important milestones so we can go to the next one. The making of a young activist. Next bullet point. Hard times growing up poor, Black, and in racist Troy, Alabama. And I sort of set the racism in context. He'll give you some names of people that were killed and lynched in that area. These lynchings go all back. I remember my mother telling me that her mother told her about a lynching in Salisbury, North Carolina, my hometown. I never saw such a thing. And then I never read anything. I was born in New Jersey, but when I visited relatives in North Carolina, I never saw anything. But then all of a sudden, I went to the Without Sanctuary lynching exhibit, and there was a quadruple lynching in Salisbury, North Carolina. Black oral tradition is so important. But how you view that. Next bullet point. The Black church was comforting, restorative, and the biblical narratives promised deliverance from poverty and oppression as it did in days of enslavement. But you would add, John Lewis would say, you don't wait to the afterlife for that. You get involved to bring the beloved community here, to make your life and the society you live in conjunction with those principles. And you bring that to life now. Let's move on to the next one. No wonder preaching the chickens. Interesting part in the Bible, not in the Bible, in Meach's book, where he's talking about John Lewis practiced preaching to the chickens, and he refused to eat the chickens his parents had killed, and he had a funeral to chicken. So that's an interesting aspect of life, but it demonstrates his humanity. Reference, the next bullet point. Reference for justice and chickens will be extended to you from his life as a young boy. What touched him about the Bible was the humanity was all people. And those that use the Bible to preach racial segregation and racism and discrimination were using it. He picked up on early, and thus desired to go to a college. He could learn and play his role in the struggle and to be part of the study vision. And he's to go to American Baptist Seminary. Go to the next bullet point. So this theological seminary in Nashville. See this. Even before he arrived there and he began to read liberal Christians and radical theology, he is someone who not witnessed, but was there. The 55, the expulsion of Arthur and Lucy in the University of Alabama, and the murder of civil rights advocate Thomas Brewer and Columbia. There he met a number of that will play a role in the civil rights movement. James Bell,
Sorry, clock, and I just wanted to ask you a question.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Since we were just on the young portion, I just want to ask you about religions becoming less important for young people, and it was such a foundation for John Lewis and his journey. How becoming less important than what institutions could provide young today in 2020 with a foundation on which to build activism and their judaism?
Well, I think constitutions can play a role. A number of organizations, progressions coming out of college now that are there. A number of students in Black Lives Matter, a number of students in civil rights type organs, even in AAC. So there are many roots to that. I also see a resurgence in church activity as well. So there are these engines that are there, and that will be created. Also, I would say this, that young involved in politics, okay, as well. So on to the next bullet, another question, but let me, Shunsu, just move on. This is a 60 sit-in move. We can move on. He was in Greensboro, North Carolina, but John Lewis participated in the ones in go ahead, Anniston, Alabama, and we see that. Also, Mississippi, Freedom Summer in '64, 3 dead in Mississippi, Good, Cheney, and Schwerner. This was very, very important and instrumental in the campaign for the passage of the Voting Rights Bill. And let's go on to next. Bloody Sunday, Selma, Alabama, John Lewis here being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So I think this is very important. And that was critical, of course, for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Those events there. Okay, on the march, we see him. That's the Reverend James Abernathy, James Flynn from SNCC, and John Lewis over on the right. Next slide. Next slide. John Lewis March on Washington. We could talk about that. They wanted him to edit his speech because they first thought it was too rebel. Let's go on to the next one. The Presidential Medal of Freedom here, which I think is very, very important here. And we can go on to the next one. That's Barack Obama giving him that here. So I just like to conclude with this quote from his autobiography on the future of race riots in America. It goes, I believe in America. I love this country. That's why I tried so hard over the years to make it better. This is unquestionably the greatest nation on earth, land of limitless opportunity and possibility, not just in material terms, but in more ethical and spiritual terms. I believe the next frontier for America lies in the direction of our spiritual strength as a community. This is the place where we must move if we are to continue to lead the rest of the world. It is not just materially or militarily that we must measure our might, but morally. So there was this notion here, okay? There was this notion that if America was to continue its leadership in the world, it would have to perfect its society much more than it had. It had to do what? It had to make serious change. So Edward Kennedy, talking about John Lewis, and this is when Ed Kennedy was alive, and he was talking about his autobiography. But he makes this last quote, and I think it's very important. I'll conclude with this. John Lewis spent most of his life walking against the wind of the times, but he was surely walking with the wind of history. The jury is still out. Whether John Lewis is walking with the wind of history will be left up to us to carry on his legacy. Will we make that legacy real? Okay. Okay, Joseph. I think we're under the tyranny of the clock, but that's okay. You have a question now. I can't hear you. Mute. You're muted. I can't hear.
Yeah.
Margot, take a question. Joseph is not coming through.
Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Joseph.
Oh, there
There
he
he
is.
is.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I
Okay,
think it's
good.
phone.
Yeah.
So you were talking about activism, the Black Lives Matter, and from the book, I think page 141, John Lewis talks about we are tired. He says we're tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, you being the white moderates, and saying, "Be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom, and we want it now." And Jon Meacham says he spoke for the young and he spoke for the future of America. In the summer, we saw the same sentiment echoed in the Black Lives Matter speeches. People would walk up and say, "We are tired." And it feels oxymoronic coming from Black people in a civil rights protest or in a protest against systemic racism, when on the one hand, you say you are tired, but here you are mobilized in full force against protesting against the same thing you say you're tired. So here's the question. Are we really tired, or could it just be that we're just expressing frustration in dealing with people who have absolutely no love for us?
Well, I think people are tired of experiencing persistent racism. They are tired of that. I hope they are not tired of the struggle. Sometimes people can get weary of the struggle, but I hope that there is this ability to rejuvenate oneself, because racism is deeply entrenched and it will be a struggle to get rid of it. And about the violence, and this is something that is very, very important. The tactics that John Lewis employed, and SNCC for a period, and CORE, and SCLC, those tactics worked to a certain extent then. But today's situation is different. So you have to adjust your tactics to your strategy. You have to adjust your tactics to the times. Now, what they were attempting to do was to essentially, not for some, change the hearts of the racists. That may not work at all. But also to expose the racism to which they had been subjected to for years, but not covered, and to expose American hypocrisy to the world with the idea of inducing global pressure. So that's part of it. What I think we needed to do perhaps more is that once that Voting Rights Act came in, one needed to double down even more on that to secure it, okay? And not just presidential elections, local elections, county elections, state elections, off-year non-presidential congressional elections. All of those elections have to be addressed. Political power. So I think, yes, one can get tired, but you've got to go on. Margot.
I wanted to ask you about the use of the media in the protests.
Mm-hmm.
And Meacham wrote, part of the movement's strategy, one ably executed by Julian Bond, was to keep the students' nonviolent work consistently in the news. How did John Lewis contribute to some of the shaping of public perception in the media?
Well, I think one of the major ways was, of course, willingness to go out into the streets to protest. And that was one of the ways that they were strategically using the media. Remember, a lot of the violence, which we can track through the press, was on the back page for decades. I mean, there was some coverage in the Times of lynchings in the 20s and 30s, but it's in the back page somewhere. No one paid any attention. What they did was to take use of television, to make use of television, the social media of that day, and have it broadcast all over the United States and over the world. I haven't shown you here, but I can show you newspapers from Ethiopia, from Germany, from France, from England, from Italy, coverage and stories about American civil rights movement and about Selma and Anniston, Alabama. They made effective use of the media to mobilize, to make Malcolm X's idea that this is a human rights struggle and a global struggle real to people. So in a sense, Nikki Giovanni said the revolution will not be televised, but yes, the revolution was televised. And you may say, was the revolution really a revolution? It was an incomplete revolution. And it's incomplete because racism was so deeply entrenched. And I think this generation will find that too.
I hope so.
Your children will have to fight the next struggle. If you think it's going to be over with you, you're here to set the stage and move the marker forward.
I just
like
wanted to
to say
interrupt
one
for a
thing.
second and
Yes, Shunsu, you want to
I
open
just
it up?
wanted to remind the members that they do have the opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Greene or the two students. If you want to just type it in the chat, Leland will field those questions.
I like to say one thing. With this election, I had two granddaughters. One was 18 and one was 22. And I made a point of contacting them, telling them about the struggle and everything else. And throughout the years, I made it a point to take them to different museums throughout the country to let them see for themselves what the struggle was. In fact, I spent 2 days over at the African Museum with my granddaughters so they could see what this is about, because the bottom line is that if they're not taught what has come before, some of them have no clue what's going on now. And I just feel that that's so important to take the young children and take them out there and let them learn, give them books. I make a point of sending them books to read about their past and what has happened.
Yes, that's very important. Very important. And you must get involved with your local school districts, because in America, education, unlike in some countries, is very decentralized. Even within states, it's decentralized. So the books that are used in your school districts are often determined by your local school boards. We have an Amistad Commission, but whether the Amistad Commission guidelines are put into operation varies from district to district. So you're 100% right, but there's an effort that we got to move on that level.
Dr. Greene, I would like to ask regarding the issue of the white moderate. So, I mean, Dr. King noted that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council, but the so-called white moderate who's more devoted to order than justice. This sort of negative piece where there's a lack of this order, is being replaced, is being sacrificed on the altar. The positive piece for justice is being sacrificed on the altar of negative peace. And one of the successes of the civil rights movement was that it was able to, as you said, present their case as a moral one to America and to the world. But right now, the struggle for us is that how do you present the socioeconomic disparity, the judicial inequality within the Black community as a moral issue to a predominantly white moderate country that sees those issues as failures of the Black community and not as America's failures?
I think one of the ways that we have to do is we have to get involved in media. We have to make sure that our history of public policy, of neglect, which has a historic track record, is laid before the public. And so when someone said, oh, this pandemic has brought forth and shed new light on health inequalities. Well, we know the health inequalities have existed for 50 years. You go through the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the Black Medical Association, the National Medical Association, and look at their journal, as well as public health. You've got a half century of data. What we need to do is to start having programs on major network and cable on these issues. During the 60s, there were NBC white papers and whatever they called them. There were documentaries on this. We need to put forth those documentaries. We need to push those to those channels. And we need to also get at other media platforms to get the message across. Okay. And some of Black media social media is discussing this. But you're talking about the white moderates and the mainstream. We need to get on those platforms and start getting the data out. The data has existed for 50 years. But when they declared victory and passed the Martin Luther King holiday, which they should have and should have done it earlier, it became a way in which they had declared victory over the problem of racism. It wasn't a victory. Racism still persisted. So we need to get back into doing that. Yes.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we are running out of time. It's already noon, but thank you so much, Dr. Greene. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Margot. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Round of applause. Very much appreciate your time and working with us. It was wonderful. I just want to say also thank you to all of our members. Thank you for your support. Thank you for joining us today.